I'm sorry, are you? My date. Orion Oakley blinked, stunned. He was standing at the edge of a lavish, flower-drenched ballroom, holding a wriggling toddler in one arm and a juice box in the other. He glanced behind him, assuming the question wasn't for him, but no one else was around. Just him, his 3-year-old daughter Florence, and the most beautiful woman he'd ever seen in his life. She was wearing a champagne-colored gown that shimmered under the chandelier light. Her dark hair was pulled back, her eyes wide with confusion and something else. Amusement. What?" he stammered. She tilted her head, eyebrows raised. "Holland Orwin, maid of honor, you're—" "Orion Oakley, I'm just not your date," he said quickly. "I think there's been some kind of mix-up." "Oh," she blinked. "That's strange. My cousin said she was setting me up with someone last minute. Tall, dark hair, blue suit. You match the description perfectly." Orion looked down at himself. Navy blazer, yes. Dress pants he hadn't worn in 2 years, yes. Florence had spilled applesauce on his shirt earlier, so he'd had to borrow a clean one from his brother. He hadn't even meant to step into the ballroom, he'd just been trying to find the bathroom for Florence. "I'm not your date," he repeated, flushing. "I'm just here dropping off my niece." "Well, not niece, my daughter, Florence. She's the flower girl, my sister's the wedding planner." Florence chose that moment to say, "Hi, I peed already." Holland burst out laughing, covering her mouth with one hand. "Well, that's good to know," she said, crouching down. "Hi, Florence." "I'm Holland. You look like a princess," Florence announced. Orion felt his heart twist. "Sorry, she's very honest." "No, that made my entire week," Holland said, standing again with a warm smile. "Well, since you're here and you're not my date and I'm still solo, would you mind pretending to be him? Just for tonight." "What?" "I don't want to sit at the singles table, please. You're already dressed for it, and your daughter is clearly part of the wedding." "I'll make sure they seat Florence with the kids. Just say yes, Orion," she said, eyes twinkling. "What's the worst that could happen?" He hesitated. This was not the plan. He wasn't even supposed to be here more than 5 minutes. But then Florence tugged his blazer and whispered, "I want to sit with the princess." That did it. "Okay. Sure," he said, running a hand through his hair. "Why not?" 20 minutes later, he was seated beside Holland at a candlelit table, his suit jacket off, sleeves rolled up, watching Florence giggle with the other flower girls. The reception was extravagant crystal chandeliers, a string quartet, waiters in tuxedos. It was the kind of wedding he'd only seen in movies. "So," Holland said, sipping her wine. "What do you do, not my date?" "I'm a mechanic," he replied, reaching for the bread basket. "Own a small auto repair shop in Brookview." "Brookview," she repeated, nodding. "That's about an hour from here." "Yeah, it's not fancy, but it's honest work, pays the bills. And your wife, don't have one." His voice was flat. "Her name was Kelsey. She left when Florence was 2, haven't seen her since." "I'm sorry," he shrugged. "I'm used to it." She hesitated, then said gently, "You're doing a great job, by the way. Florence is amazing." He looked at her, surprised. "Thanks, I try." He wasn't used to compliments, not like that. Especially not from someone like her, elegant, graceful, with an effortless charm that made heads turn every time she laughed. "And what about you?" he asked. "What do you do?" She paused, lifting her glass again. "I work in finance." It was vague, too vague, but he didn't press. People lied at weddings all the time. They danced twice. The second time, she grinned and tugged him onto the floor, and he went willingly, forgetting everything else as she moved with him, her hand warm in his. "Why do I feel like I've known you forever?" she whispered. He didn't have an answer. Only that he hadn't smiled this much in years. By the time the cake was cut and Florence was asleep in his arms, Holland stood beside him at the exit, her heels dangling from her fingers. "I'm glad you were my mistaken date," she said softly. "Me too." She reached out, pressing a folded napkin into his pocket. "That's my number, in case you ever want to do this again." "I don't think I could afford this kind of wedding again," he joked. She laughed. "I meant dinner." He looked at her, heart pounding. "Yeah. I'd like that." As he walked out into the night, cradling his daughter and feeling like the world had tilted slightly, he didn't realize that the woman he was falling for wasn't just charming, beautiful, and kind. She was also a millionaire. And she had just fallen for the poor mechanic with a daughter and a tired old pickup truck. Orion didn't expect to see her again. He figured it had been one of those fleeting, perfect nights like a firework that dazzled and disappeared. But 3 days later, as he stood beneath the hood of a rusted-out sedan in his garage, covered in grease and cursing under his breath, a sleek black BMW pulled up outside. He wiped his hands on a rag and stepped out, squinting against the sunlight. The driver's door opened, and there she was, stepping out like she didn't belong on the cracked pavement of his parking lot but on the cover of a fashion magazine. "Holland," he asked, stunned. "I was hoping you'd be here." She closed the door gently. "I figured I owed you a real first date," he blinked. "You drove all the way to Brookview, you didn't call. I didn't think you were serious." "I was," she said, lifting her chin. "Still am." He looked down at his oil-streaked shirt. "I'm not exactly dressed for dinner." "Then it's a good thing I brought dinner with me," she said, turning and popping the trunk. Inside were 2 paper bags from a local deli, a picnic blanket, and a bottle of sparkling lemonade. She glanced over her shoulder. "There's a place nearby that's not all concrete and car parts. There's a little field behind the shop," he said slowly. "Couple trees, some shade. Perfect." She followed him around back, where the tall grass swayed gently in the breeze and an old wooden fence marked the edge of the property. He spread out the blanket while she unpacked the food sandwiches, fruit, and 2 chocolate chip cookies wrapped in wax paper. "Didn't take you for the picnic type," he said, sitting down beside her. "I'm full of surprises." He took a bite of his sandwich and studied her. She was wearing a soft cashmere sweater over jeans and white sneakers that looked far too clean to have ever touched a gravel road. "So, what brings you to my side of the tracks?" he asked. She looked at him, her expression unreadable. "I wanted to see what your world looked like. This," he gestured around them, "it's not much, it's honest and peaceful." He didn't respond right away. "Most people don't drive luxury cars to eat sandwiches in a field." She raised an eyebrow. "Most people don't pretend to be someone's date at a wedding and end up dancing like they've known each other for years." Fair point. They sat in silence for a moment, the wind rustling the leaves above them. "I'm not used to this," she said finally. "To what?" "To not being in control. I usually know what I want, how to get it, and what it'll cost me. But this, I didn't plan for any of it. And does that bother you?" "It terrifies me." He looked at her closely. "Why?" "Because I've spent the last 5 years building a life that doesn't leave room for accidents." "Sounds exhausting." "It is." He leaned back on his elbows. "So what do you want right now?" She hesitated. "To stop pretending." He waited. "I'm not just some girl who works in finance," she said at last. "I run a private equity firm. I sit on the board of 3 companies. My name's in a couple of magazines. I've got more money than I know what to do with, and I'm the only one in my family who actually earned it." He stayed quiet. "I didn't tell you because I wanted to see if you'd still like me without all of that. You're telling me now. I don't want there to be secrets." He nodded slowly, then said, "That's a hell of a first date confession." She laughed under her breath. "Yeah," he studied her. "I don't care how many zeros are in your bank account. You brought cookies, that's what matters." She smiled, the kind that didn't come with hesitation. "And," he added, "you drove an hour to surprise a guy who doesn't even own a proper dining table." 2 hours, she corrected. Traffic. They finished the meal in easy silence, and when Florence came toddling around the corner of the shop, having just woken up from a nap in the office where one of Orion's employees had been watching her, she spotted Holland and grinned. "You came back." "I did," Holland said, crouching to her level. "I missed you." Florence climbed into her lap like she'd done it 100 times. Orion watched, something tugging inside his chest. Later, when the sun dipped low and Holland stood to leave, she turned to him at her car. "I want to see you again." "You sure?" he asked. "I've never been more sure of anything." He nodded. "All right." She leaned in and kissed his cheek, then whispered, "Don't make me wait 3 more days this time." As she pulled away, Orion stood rooted in place, watching the taillights disappear down the narrow road. He didn't know what this was turning into, but he knew one thing: it was real. And it was starting to change everything. The first time Holland stepped into Orion's auto shop, the air smelled of engine oil, pine-scented air fresheners, and something faintly sweet, apple muffins, maybe. The overhead lights buzzed softly, casting a warm haze over the rows of cars lined up like sleeping beasts. It was a far cry from the marble lobbies and glass-paneled conference rooms she was used to. "Sorry, it's not exactly 5-star, Orion said, glancing up from the car he was working on. He straightened, wiping his hands on a rag, his shirt clinging slightly from the midday heat. "I didn't come for the ambience," Holland replied, her heels clicking gently on the concrete as she walked toward him. "And I brought coffee." She held up a tray with 2 paper cups and a small brown bag. "I'm starting to think you're trying to spoil me," he said, taking the cup she offered. "Maybe I am," she said, setting the bag down on the workbench beside a socket wrench. "And maybe I wanted to see where you disappear to every day." He raised an eyebrow. "It's not exactly a mystery. I fix things, mostly engines, sometimes transmissions, occasionally broken radios. Do you like it?" He looked around the shop. "It's mine. Built it from the ground up with what little I had left after Kelsey left. It keeps a roof over our heads and food on the table." "That's enough for me," she nodded, then leaned against the workbench. "I envy that. You envy me." He gave a short laugh. "You've got a view of the skyline and probably 10 assistants." 17, she said without blinking. "And none of them know how I take my coffee." He looked at her sideways. "That sounds lonely." "It is." Holland seemed different today, less guarded, more raw. Her hair was pulled back in a low ponytail, and she wore a navy jacket over a white blouse, the kind that probably cost more than Orion's monthly rent. But there was a crease between her brows, like something had been weighing on her all morning. "You okay?" he asked. She hesitated. "I had a board meeting this morning. One of the partners doesn't think I should be spending time in Brookview." His jaw tightened. "Did he say that to your face?" "No, he said it to my assistant while I was in the room." Orion folded his arms. "What you say?" "I told him if he had something to say about my personal life, he could do it on his own time. Then I moved the meeting to the next room and had him removed." He let out a low whistle. "Remind me never to cross you." She smiled faintly. "You wouldn't last long in my world." He brushed a hand over his forehead. "I'm not trying to, I know." She paused. "And that's what makes it feel safe." He looked at her, surprised. "I've spent years surrounded by people who only want something from me. Investors, clients, social climbers. With you, it's different. You're not impressed by titles or numbers." "I don't even understand half of what you do," he said. "Exactly." She leaned forward, resting her elbows on the bench. "I want you to come to a charity gala next week." He blinked. "A what?" "It's a fundraiser. Black tie. Art auction, open bar, very high society." He stared at her. "You want me to wear a tux? I want you there." "Do I get to bring Florence?" She smiled. "It's adults only, but I already asked your sister to babysit." He narrowed his eyes. "You planned this." "I did. And if I say no, then I'll wear you down in other ways." He laughed, shaking his head. "You're relentless." Holland reached into her bag and pulled out a slim black envelope. "Here's the invite, just think about it." He took it but didn't open it right away. "I'm not the kind of guy who fits in at those things." "You're exactly the kind who stands out," she said softly. Orion didn't answer, but her words stayed with him long after she left, long after the coffee cooled on the bench and the afternoon sun dipped behind the trees. When the day of the gala arrived, he stood in front of the mirror in his sister's living room, tugging at the stiff collar of the tuxedo Holland had sent over. He hadn't asked her to, but it had arrived in a box with a handwritten note that simply read, "No excuses." Florence clapped her hands when she saw him. "You look like a prince." He bent down and kissed her forehead. "You be good for Auntie, okay? Are you gonna dance with the princess again?" He smiled. "That's the plan." When he arrived at the gala, the valet didn't know what to do with his pickup truck. Orion handed him the keys anyway and stepped into a world of glittering chandeliers, champagne fountains, and soft piano music echoing off marble floors. He spotted Holland near a sculpture installation, her dress a deep sapphire blue that shimmered under the lights. She turned as he approached, her eyes lighting up. "You clean up well," she said. "I feel like a fraud." "You're not." He looked around. "Everyone here is watching us." "They're watching me," she corrected, "because I never bring anyone, and now I did." He exhaled slowly. "You sure this is a good idea?" "No," she said. "But I want it to be." She reached for his hand, and he didn't pull away. Later, as the evening wore on and the crowd buzzed with quiet chatter, Orion stood beside her as the auctioneer introduced a painting by a rising contemporary artist. The bidding started at 10,000. "Is this the part where you raise a paddle and casually drop more money than I make in a year?" he asked under his breath. Holland didn't answer right away. Instead, she turned to him and said, "Do you trust me?" He frowned. "That's a loaded question. I want to show you something." She led him away from the auction, down a hallway lined with framed photographs of previous events. They stopped outside a glass door that opened onto a rooftop garden lit with soft lanterns and candles floating in a reflecting pool. "This is my favorite part of the building," she said. "No one ever comes up here. It's quiet. It's beautiful." She turned to face him. "I don't care if people whisper or if my board thinks I'm being reckless. I care that when I'm with you, I remember what it's like to feel honest." "I don't know how to be anyone else," he said. "Good." There was a long silence between them, then she said, "What if this wasn't just a mistake at a wedding?" He stepped closer. "What if it was the best thing that ever happened to me?" "I'm scared," she whispered. "So am I." He reached up and cupped her face gently. "But I'm still here." She leaned into his touch, and when he kissed her, it was slow and certain, like something inevitable finally catching up to them. And for the first time in a long time, neither of them wanted to run. Orion stood at the edge of the marina, the wind tugging at his collar as Holland waited beside him, her coat buttoned to the throat. The last of the guests from the gala's after-party climbed aboard a private yacht bobbing gently in the dark water, but Holland hadn't moved. She was watching him, waiting for something. "I've never been on a boat that didn't smell like fish," Orion said, his voice low. "You won't smell anything on this one," Holland replied. "It's electric, no fumes, no noise." He glanced at her. "Of course it is." She smiled faintly, but it didn't quite reach her eyes. Something had changed in the air between them after the rooftop kiss. The easy spark was still there, but now it was tangled up with something heavier, real possibility, real risk. "Do you regret coming tonight?" she asked. "I don't regret anything," he said, "but I don't think I belong in your world." "You're not in my world, you're in mine," she said. "There's a difference. Feels the same from where I'm standing." Holland drew in a breath. "Then let's try something else." He turned toward her. "Like what?" "I have a place an hour from here, near the lake. No staff, no boardrooms, no photographers. Just trees and water and a fireplace that smokes too much." "You want me to come with you?" "I want you and Florence to come with me," she said. "For the weekend." Orion hesitated. "And what happens after the weekend?" "I don't know," she said. "But I want to find out." It wasn't her voice that convinced him. It was the way she said his daughter's name, like Florence wasn't just tolerated, but welcome. 3 days later, they drove north. Florence sang to herself in the back seat, knees bouncing as the trees blurred past. Holland kept glancing back at her, her expression soft. When they arrived, the house was exactly how she described it, modest by her standards, hidden behind a thicket of birch trees, the lake visible through the wide windows in the main room. Holland handed Orion a set of keys and showed Florence the basket of wooden blocks she'd brought from the city. "She remembered I like the red ones," Florence whispered to Orion. That night, after Florence fell asleep curled beneath a quilt in the guest room, Orion found Holland sitting on the back deck, a blanket around her shoulders and a glass of wine untouched beside her. "She had a good day," he said, lowering himself into the chair next to hers. "She's easy to love," Holland replied. "So are you," he said, surprising himself. She looked at him then. "You mean that?" "I wouldn't say it if I didn't." She reached for his hand. "There's something you should know." He stiffened. "A few days ago I made a decision," she said. "I've been offered a new position overseas, Singapore. It's a major expansion for the firm, but I turned it down." He blinked. "Why?" "Because I didn't want to build a life alone again. I didn't want to leave right when something real was starting." He stared at her, stunned. "I've spent years chasing the next big thing, but nothing ever felt like enough until now," she said. "I want slow mornings. I want chaos in the kitchen and tiny shoes by the door. I want the mess." He couldn't speak right away. "I didn't want to tell you until I was sure," she continued. "But I want you to know I'm not going anywhere." He stood slowly and pulled her into his arms. "You're serious?" She nodded against his chest. "I don't have much to offer you," he said. "No stocks, no yachts, no business connections. You have everything I've been looking for," she said. The next morning, Orion woke to the sound of Florence's laughter echoing from the kitchen. He padded down the hallway to find her perched on a stool, helping Holland stir pancake batter, flour dusted across the counter like snow. "Daddy, we're cooking," Florence beamed. "You're making a mess," he said, stepping behind her and kissing the top of her head. "She insisted on adding blueberries," Holland said. "She said it's the only way you'll eat them. She's not wrong." Later, as they sat on the porch with their plates balanced on their laps and the lake shimmering in the morning sun, Holland set her fork down and turned toward him. "I bought something," she said. "Should I be worried?" She reached into the pocket of her cardigan and pulled out a thin envelope. "It's a lease for a house in Brookview," he froze. "You're moving, I want to be close to you and to Florence. I want to build something where you are, not where I've always been." He stared at the paper. "Holland, I'm not asking for anything in return," she said quickly. "Not a ring, not a promise, I want all of it." She stopped. "I want the house," he said. "I want you and pancakes and whatever this is turning into." He stood and stepped toward her, taking her hands in his. "I didn't know I needed more than what I had until you showed up in that ballroom." She blinked. "Are you saying yes?" "I'm saying forever," he said. "If you'll have me." He lowered himself to one knee, not with a ring, but with steady eyes and a heart wide open. Florence gasped. "Are you marrying the princess?" Holland laughed, tears in her eyes. "If she says yes." "Yes," she whispered. "Yes, yes, yes." Orion rose and wrapped his arms around her, the smell of pancakes and wildflowers drifting through the air. And just like that, the poor mechanic who never believed in fairy tales found himself living one with the woman who had everything, but still chose him. The rain had begun just as Orion carried the last box into the new house. It tapped gently against the roof, mixing with the sound of Florence's laughter from upstairs, where she was exploring her new bedroom with Holland's help. Orion set the box down in the living room and looked around. The walls were still bare, but the space was already alive. Their lives were stitched across the floor in mismatched rugs, second-hand furniture, and Holland's framed photographs leaning against the wall, waiting to be hung. He reached for the last roll of tape and paused at the sight of Holland descending the stairs, barefoot, hair damp from bathing Florence, her sweater sleeves pushed to her elbows. She insisted on lining her books by color, she said, brushing a curl from her cheek. And she asked if she could name her room the castle. I said yes. He laughed softly. "She's going to want a crown next." "She already has one," Holland said. "She made it out of pipe cleaners and told me she's the boss of bedtime now." He leaned against the stairwell. "She's got you wrapped around her finger." "I'm okay with that." He reached for her hand, pulled her down the last step. "You sure about this, about all of it?" "I've never been more sure of anything," she said, resting her forehead against his. "I've spent my whole life building empires that didn't feel like home. You and Florence, you're the only thing that does." They stood there for a moment, the rain outside softening into a hush, the quiet enveloping them like a secret only they shared. Later that night, after Florence had fallen asleep, the house lit only by the glow of the fireplace Holland insisted on lighting despite the mild weather. Orion found her on the floor surrounded by an open box of records. "Vinyl?" he asked, lowering himself beside her. "Some things are better with a little crackle," she said, holding up a sleeve with a blue jazz label. "I thought you'd like this one." He watched her place it on the turntable, the needle settling into the groove, the music drifting out like a memory. They sat in silence as the saxophone filled the room, the warmth of the fire painting their faces in gold. "I've been thinking," he said quietly, "about the shop." She leaned her head against his shoulder. "What about it? I want to expand, not just repairs. I want to teach kids high schoolers, maybe get their hands dirty, show them how engines work. Real skills, something they can carry." She looked up at him, her eyes soft. "That's incredible. I'd need space, support, maybe connections." "You'll have all of it," she said. "Whatever you need." He kissed the top of her head. "You always say that." "Because I mean it." The next morning, Holland stood at the kitchen counter, reviewing a contract while Orion made coffee. Florence sat on a stool, building a tower of cereal boxes and giggling every time one tumbled. "Don't forget," Holland said, not looking up, "the interview's at 11. Orion turned from the stove. "Interview?" For the mentorship program, she replied. You've got 5 applicants already. I sent out the forms yesterday. You didn't waste any time. I had help, she said, nodding toward Florence, who was now stacking teaspoons. He crossed the room and kissed her cheek. You're dangerous when you're determined. She turned and looped her arms around his neck. I only fight for the things worth keeping. Weeks passed and the house began to feel lived in. Pictures went up. Florence started school. Orion's program launched with 3 teens from the community center. Holland began consulting part-time, choosing projects she cared about. She traded boardrooms for home-cooked dinners and found joy in mornings spent in sweatpants rather than suits. One Sunday afternoon, as they picnicked in the backyard under a sky streaked with gold, Florence curled up in Holland's lap with a book while Orion repaired a squeaky swing nearby. Is this what you imagined? He asked, tightening the chain. No, Holland said, brushing Florence's hair back. It's better. He glanced over. Even without the skyline, she smiled. I'd trade every view in the world for this one. As the sun dipped behind the trees, Orion walked over and took her hand. There's something I've been working on. Besides playground equipment, he reached into his pocket and pulled out a small velvet box. Her breath caught as he opened it, a gold band, simple, elegant, with a single stone in the center, warm as champagne. I never thought I'd ask anyone this again, he said. But I can't imagine another morning without you. I want all of it, the noise, the quiet, the chaos, the calm. Will you marry me, Holland Orwin? She didn't speak right away. She looked at him, then at Florence, who had perked up at the word marry. Does this mean we get to have cake? Florence asked. Holland laughed, tears slipping down her cheeks. Yes, and a dress and music. And all the people we love. Then she turned back to Orion. Yes, 1,000 times yes. He slid the ring onto her finger and Florence clapped so hard she knocked over her juice. They didn't wait long. A month later, they held a small ceremony beneath the oak tree behind the house. Holland wore a simple ivory dress. Florence danced barefoot through the grass with a crown of wildflowers. Orion stood tall beside his brother, who served as best man while Holland's cousin officiated. There were no chandeliers, no velvet ropes, no press, just their people. Their life. When Orion kissed his bride, the guests erupted in cheers, but all he could hear was her heartbeat. They danced under string lights and toasted with cider. Florence fell asleep on a pile of blankets, and someone covered her with Orion's jacket. As the night wound down, Holland leaned against Orion's chest, watching the last of the lanterns flicker out. Do you ever think about that night? She asked. The wedding. No, the one before, when I mistook you for someone else, he smiled. Only every day. What if I hadn't walked up to you? Then I would have found a way to walk up to you, he said. Eventually, she tilted her head. You think fate would have done the work for us? No, he said, wrapping his arms tighter around her. I think we would have done the work. Because it's worth it. She kissed him softly. It is. And as the stars blinked alive overhead, the girl who had everything and the man who never thought he had enough stood hand in hand, knowing they'd created something neither of them had ever expected, a forever that felt like home.